Good morning. It's February 22nd on this early Tuesday morning in Australia. Welcome back to 28storms.com. This is your tropical cyclone update for the South Pacific and surrounding waters around Australia. Here is the latest infrared, and as you can see, Tropical Cyclone Carlos has made quite the comeback that we expected ever since it reemerged back over the southwest or southeast Indian Ocean. And we see the central dense overcast really beginning to get its act together over top that low-level surface circulation as it moves on toward the west-southwest towards Exmouth. And over toward the South Pacific, we're also still dealing with Tropical Cyclone Atu. Although this storm has rapidly intensified over the last couple days, we've been fortunate in that the inner core of the storm, where the strongest winds were located, have persisted or remained east of Vanuatu. So even though the islands probably got some very strong winds, some heavy rainfall, they were at least spared the brunt of the storm, and that's most certainly good news. Some other additional good news is that the storm is still forecast to remain away from all land masses as it moves on off toward the southeast. And as we've been saying for the past several days, the storm is going to remain north and east of New Zealand, so areas around there don't have much to worry about. If anything, it's going to bring along some really good surf conditions, I would presume, in that area. Here is the latest enhanced infrared of Tropical Cyclone Carlos, and you can really see those coldest cloud tops located directly over the center. And some slight intensification is still forecast to continue over the next day or so, even though it's still partially hugging the coastline. And we expect Carlos to make it back to Category 2 status by the time it makes a landfall around Onslow and Exmouth, along with Coral Bay and Dampier further toward the east. Here's the latest visible satellite, and we're finally getting some daylight after a long evening, and we're seeing that Carlos is much more organized than it was yesterday, despite the fact that the central dense overcast is partially over Western Australia. But you can see that the low-level circulation is embedded directly underneath the primary convection, which is obviously a healthy indicator for this storm. Here is another visible satellite perspective, this one coming from NRL Monterey. This is the latest microwave satellite frame, and most of the storm was not captured by this particular pass. But nonetheless, you can still see that the inner core is trying to tighten at the last second right here, right before it begins to make its next landfall along Western Australia. And also here's the latest mimic microwave imagery from the SIMS website, and you can see that Carlos is fairly well defined with that circulation just offshore. Here is the latest official forecast from the Bureau of Meteorology, and as you can see, we now have Carlos as a Category 2, and it's just about to make another landfall between Karratha and Onslow, and it's going to continue moving west-southwest in the general direction of Exmouth. And we're going to still have the highest risk of flooding right along the coastline, along with potential wind gusts in excess of 130 kilometers per hour. This is the latest forecast from the Joint Typhoon Warning Center, and once again it's in fairly good agreement with the Bureau of Meteorology. Both agencies have been very close to each other in terms of the forecast tracks and intensities with this storm ever since the storm originated near the Northern Territory. There really hasn't been much disagreement, and there certainly isn't much disagreement this time around. The Joint Typhoon Warning Center continues to forecast more intensification with a peak intensity as it begins to make landfall near Exmouth, with a general track more toward the south thereafter, with some weakening beginning to happen. If there's any disagreement, it's probably here in the long term, when the Bureau of Meteorology is forecasting a lot of intensification, whereas the Joint Typhoon Warning Center expects it to begin to diminish a lot sooner. Here's a quick model summary, and as you can tell, there's really not that many outliers in this general scenario. All the models show a continued west-southwest track, so don't expect that track to change much at all until the storm at least makes it past Australia. And by this point, even if it were to hook more toward the southeast, the storm will be a lot more extratropical by then, meaning that we won't be dealing with the true tropical cyclone that we've been watching for the past week. And once again, we're still dealing with Tropical Cyclone Atu. Even though it's really not going to impact any land masses directly, this is still a fairly impressive storm system, and thus the reason why I'm showing you this latest visible satellite. The eye is not the most well-defined eye we've ever seen, but it's still quite an impressive image nonetheless. And here's the latest Joint Typhoon Warning Center track, and of course the storm is moving away from New Caledonia and Vanuatu, and it's going to safely remain north of Australia until it becomes extratropical, and by that point it'll be further toward the east. Here's the latest spaghetti model plot 4 out 2, and as you can tell, every single model keeps the storm away from New Caledonia. Here is the latest 12Z forecast from the ECMWF. This is 0 hour, advancing into 24 and 48 hours, and as you can see, Tropical Cyclone Carlos has already made it through Exmouth and is ever so slowly beginning to move away from Australia. By 72 hours, we now have Tropical Cyclone Atu has fully bypassed New Zealand to the north and east, whereas Carlos is finally going to the graveyard and is really beginning to weaken over much cooler sea surface temperatures. By 96 and 120 hours, both Tropical Cyclones Carlos and Atu are out of the picture, but at the same time now, this is day 5 once again, but the models have been trying to develop a broad area of low pressure to the north of Western Australia and the top end. Now, this really isn't a very strong area of low pressure, but it still would be one to watch on satellite imagery in case there really is any organization. But by 144 hours, we begin to see the true signs of tropical cyclone formation to the north of Port Hedland, and luckily by 168 hours, the storm has intensified, but is moving more westerly than southerly. By 192, 216, and 240 hours, which is day 10, according to this model, the new storm develops but moves on off to the west instead of directly impacting Western Australia, which would certainly be a much needed break given the amount of rainfall many areas along the coastal areas have gotten over the past week. Here's the latest GFS sea level pressure forecast, and as we advance this into time, by 60 hours, we now have Tropical Cyclone Carlos to the west of Coral Bay, and over toward the southeast, we have Tropical Cyclone Atu remaining off the coast of New Zealand, moving away. And by 96 and 120 hours, which is 5 days out from now, we see a lot of agreement between the GFS and ECMWF with a lot of suspect rainfall and broad area of low pressure extending as far east as the Gulf of Carpentaria. So that whole northern area will have to be monitored extensively in the medium range for any signs of tropical cyclone formation. And as we can see, this is getting really far out. This is day 7.5. And according to this, we could have low pressure anywhere from the Gulf all the way as far west as Western Australia, with potentially the surface low either being maxed out over land or possibly over water. So there's plenty of scenarios that can still happen this far out. And finally, this is the no-gaps model, and as we advanced into time, we see that the model is also developing broad low pressure, although it's not seeing it as clearly as the other two models, but that's not to say it can't happen. Now, in addition to just watching forecast model guidance over the next several days, another thing to look for on satellite imagery will be what happens with this strung out area of troughiness that's currently moving north out of the mid-latitudes, as we can see along here. I highly suspect that this trough is eventually going to stall out further toward the north over the open waters, and that could be a major key in trying to get surface low formation after several days. Again, this is going to take quite a long time. We still have 2 other tropical cyclones to deal with, so we'll just play it by ear over the next several days. So, just to recap, Tropical Cyclone Atu remains a powerful cyclone but is no threat to land. Carlos is going to make its final approach to Australia, and it's likely going to impact areas along Western Australia between Port Hedland and Coral Bay as a Category 2 cyclone on the Australian cyclone scale, before moving out to sea and then finally dissipating over cooler waters to the southwest. Even despite the fact that both of these storms will soon be out of the picture, we're still going to have a broad area of low pressure to watch over the next 4 to 8 days over the Northern Territory, Gulf, and Timor Sea, and we'll just have to wait and see if that system begins to organize into a potential cyclone. But that's all I have for now. Thanks for checking out 28storms.com. Please visit 28storms.com/cyclone for more tropical cyclone tracking information. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel here at youtube.com/28cyclones for more tropical cyclone updates in the future. So thanks again for stopping by, and spread the word if you think that other people may be interested in these videos.